So thank you very much, Nan, for the invitation to speak at this meeting. I've always enjoyed ISB, but I think the theme around this meeting is particularly exciting. So I'm very happy to be a part of it. And in keeping with the theme of this meeting, I wanted to discuss various efforts that have happened sort of broadly in the study of human behavior to reflect on diversity in our field. And so ultimately, I think we're starting to ask a question of who is really represented in the study of human behavior broadly, and what impact does that have for understanding subfields of human behavior like bilingualism. So there have been various papers and consciousness raising devices to really call attention to this question of diversity and who is represented, who is really participating in our science. And I think the most famous of which for all of us is the 2010 paper describing weird populations and how the study of human behavior has really been centered around particular world regions and particular populations within those world regions. But ultimately, the empirical record in many fields of human behavior overselects particular identities, particular geographies, and particular lived experiences, and in essence, deselects other kinds of experiences, identities, and geographies for participation. And I think the scientific consequences of this are very significant. So in particular, a lot of what we know and extrapolate from is based on a limited set of regions and populations, and this has consequences for really key issues of generalizability, replicability that we now confront in the study of human behavior. So I'll start by just presenting a few sort of snapshot views of where we are generally in the study of child development and in the study of bilingualism with respect to this question of participation and representation. So I'll start by putting up this chart, which is a chart of participant representation in mainstream developmental psychology journals. So developmental psychology, developmental science, child development, Journal of Experimental Child Psychology, infant and child development. And this is a chart of about 3 million participants that are represented in all of the papers published last year in these journals. And what you can see is, I think it's important to know, when you interpret this chart, that the scale is a nonlinear scale. So there's a big difference between the light blue and the medium blue and the dark blue. And what we see is a very strong geographical skew towards particular world regions of North America, Western Europe, and some representation from China, but really see very strong representation of particular world regions. And we also see very minimal representation of participants from the global south. So one question we might ask is, given all of the efforts that have been made to call this sort of problem to our attention, have there been changes in our practices around recruitment, participation over time? So have we sort of improved in this respect? So I'll start by presenting the results of a recent meta-analysis that I published with Alex Christia, Lana Karasik, Sarah Rajendra, and Lisa Oakes, really looking at representation in studies of child development, early child development over time. So the basic question that I was interested in asking is whether developmental research has become more diverse over time, and whether we're really getting broader participation, broader engagement at the participant level in developmental science. So for this paper, we coded all papers published in early development of 2011, the year after the Henrik et al. Weird paper, to 2022, with the goal of looking at whether we have changed or shifted in different aspects of demographics of participants. So we coded data from developmental psychology, developmental science, infancy, and child development, selecting these journals because they're generalist journals in study of human development, and they aspire to broad and global representation. And the papers published on early child development on typically developing children in these journals amounted to about 1 million participants. So I'll go through different dimensions of diversity looking at changes over time. So if we look at participant race and ethnicity, we can see that from 2011 to 2022, there remains a very strong skew towards two things. One is representation of white or predominantly white samples. And the second is a tendency to not report race, ethnicity, or other measures of community of descent in published research. And of course, I appreciate the various complexities in reporting these data and that they may not be the best proxies of community descent for every population. Looking at geographical origin, so where were participants tested between 2011, 2022, there's an increasing trend towards reporting where participants were tested, but there's also, even in 2022, about 40% of papers didn't state where their participants were tested or where they're from. If we look at the papers where participant representation or origin, geographical origin was reported, we can see that there remains a very strong skew towards North America, Western Europe, and very little diversification across other world regions over time. Looking at SES over time, we know we have a lot of evidence now that SES affects many aspects of early child development, but there remains an unwavering tendency to not report details about SES in papers on early child development. And then moving to language experience, reporting participants' language experience, what languages they speak, whether they're monolingual or multilingual, we can see that for the most part, papers don't report their children's, the language experience of children sampled in the papers. If we look at papers divided by whether they study language, so whether it's a language-related topic or a non-linguistic topic, we can see a very significant difference. So for papers that relate to language, there's a tendency to report language experience. For papers that don't relate to language, there's a very little tendency to report language experience of participants. So implicit in this is the assumption, which I think is a logical assumption, that language experience is relevant, particularly for the study of child language. So moving to representation of multilingualism, so whether children are raised bilingually or multilingually versus monolingually in language development journals, there was an analysis published in the Journal of First Language last year by Evan Kidd and Rowena Garcia, demonstrating a very strong skew towards particular Indo-European languages in language development journals. So they actually looked at journals from the inception of the journal. And looking at the kinds of participants that are sampled in these journals, you can see a similar trend. So there's a predominant focus on monolingual children. There's a strong tendency to not report the language experience of children. And there are relatively few studies looking at multilingual children where that information is reported, or both multilingual and monolingual children. So in general, the psychological development of multilingual children is an active area of scholarship, and that's obviously evident in conferences such as ISB, which are really focused on understanding the linguistic psychological behavior of multilingual learners. But multilingualism, as you can see, is underreported in published research, although it's very well represented in populations around the world. And this has implications for generalizability of existing theories, which really should encompass all learners, not just monolingual learners from particular world regions. And I think the geographical biases that I presented in earlier slides are in part a cause of linguistic biases that we see in the study of bilingualism. So I'll talk today about multilingualism and infant development, which is my area of research, as Nan mentioned, presenting evidence for developmental processes in multilingual infants that are distinct from developmental processes that have been revealed and established in monolingual infants. And I'll present a new theoretical framework that I've worked on with colleagues to try to articulate how pathways to perception, learning, cognition, memory may differ from multilingual infants versus monolingual infants. So in particular, I'll focus on bilingualism early development, presenting results from my studies in Singapore, which is a really multilingual society, and first looking at visual attention exploration, looking at nascent language knowledge and social development. And because I work with infants, I'll actually really be looking at effects of bilingualism in terms of exposure. So these are typically infants who are pre-verbal, who either don't have much of a productive vocabulary or who have a very modest productive vocabulary. So really looking at early effects of multilingualism on perception, learning, and memory. And then I'll, at the end, tie this all together into a unifying framework that endeavors to sort of integrate these findings across different areas. So looking for convergence to how information across domains is perceived, encoded, and learned. So the first question, the first set of studies I'll be presenting really just looks at a very, very basic process in infant development. So if any of you have done infant research at a behavioral level, you'll probably have noticed that the way in which we study infant psychological processes is often by examining their looking time to particular stimuli. And one of the reasons why that's very appealing for studying infant development is because looking time is something that's observable. Listening is not something that's observable. You don't really know if someone's really listening to you, but you can usually tell if they're looking at something. So looking time measures are actually the most common measure in which infant psychological processes are studied. And looking time is used to measure a very broad swath of abilities, ranging from object perception to false belief, theory of mind, to social perception, music perception. So it's really a pervasive measure and a pervasive proxy for psychological processing in infant populations. So the basic question that I was interested in asking in this first study was whether infants explore their visual environment in different ways, depending on whether they're raised with one language or two languages. So to measure this, we used a visual habituation preference paradigm, which is an infant control paradigm. And I'll talk about what that experimental design looks like. So it's basically a habituation paradigm where infants are presented with a particular stimulus. So if you look at the animal on the left, infants are just presented with repetitions of this animal over and over again. It's exactly the same thing. And as you might expect, initially infants are interested, they engage with this animal and they look at it. And then over time, as they see repetitions over and over again, their looking time begins to subside. And this is all administered by a computer, and the computer tracks the looking time on the first trial, second trial, third trial, and successive trials, computing the amount of time that infants spend looking at this animal, display of this animal. And the function, so the curve from the initial looking time to the looking time at the point of decline is called the habituation function. So how long it takes for infants to essentially get bored of the stimulus. When looking time declines to a preset criterion, infants then see a display, a side-by-side display of two animals. One animal is the stimulus they just saw, which is the habituation stimulus. The other animal is a novel animal. And the canonical response for infants, if they have encoded the habituation stimulus, is to look over at the novel animal because they have likely reached saturation point for the animal that they were habituated to. So from this paradigm, you can get two measures. One is the habituation function, so how long it takes for infants to get bored of the stimulus. And having a steep habituation function reflects fast information processing. Having a gradual habituation function reflects more gradual information processing. And then you can look at looking time to the novel stimulus at the end of habituation. So in this task, we tested monolingual and bilingual infants, and they were equally attentive to the task. So they engaged equally in the task. But the question was not whether the infants liked the task as much based on their language experience, but it was really whether the way in which they distribute their attention over time varies by language experience. So we looked at the gradient of the habituation function, and then we looked over at the preference for the novel image in relation to whether the infants are monolingual or multilingual. So this study was a birth cohort study. It was run through the Gusto birth cohort, which is a Singaporean birth cohort that accounts for a very large portion of births in Singapore. The infants were 6 months of age at the time, and we had 54 bilingually exposed infants, and these were heterogeneous, so some were English, Malay, Tamil, Mandarin, and 60 monolingually exposed, again, heterogeneous infants. The two groups are matched on maternal education and income, and they were also matched on household income. So what we found was that bilingual infants compared to monolingual infants, if we plot the difference between the first habituation trial and the last habituation trial, bilingual infants showed a steeper habituation function. So again, this is the kind of function that's associated with faster information processing. After habituation, when infants saw the side-by-side displays, we looked at preference for the novel image, the image that infants had not been habituated to. And we found that only bilingual infants showed a significant novelty preference. So in other words, they took in the information more rapidly, and they demonstrated stronger evidence of recognition memory of the stimulus that they had just been exposed to. So we were interested in looking at whether this result really reflects a novelty orientation in bilingual infants. So do bilingual infants seek out visual novelty in their environment? In other words, do they explore their environment differently in relation to the fact that they're being exposed to two languages? So in a recent study, we capitalized on a technique that was probably the first laboratory study that was done in infant psychological processing by France in 1964. So this is a picture of France's infant lab, which is different to many infant labs today, but the basic principle remains the same. So in this kind of study, France presented infants with a display of two side-by-side objects, and infants were presented with a number of trials. And across each trial, one object stayed exactly the same, and one object changed. So you go through trial after trial after trial, the infant sees the same side-by-side display of two things. One thing is constant. So in this case, the cat on the right of the first panel is constant across all the trials, and one cat keeps changing. And what Franz looked at is whether infants show a preference for the novel changing trial over the constant trial. And he found these data that are presented in the bottom right, which is that when infants are very young, they have a fairly persistent preference for things that are familiar. And as they get older, they begin with a familiarity preference or a null preference. And as they move through trial after trial after trial, they begin to orient towards novel stimuli. So from this began a longstanding belief that infants move from a preference for things that are familiar to a preference for things that are novel. So the question here is whether bilingual infants show the same pattern of behavior. So here's an example. These aren't real data. This is just a demonstration of what it would look like if if an infant trial after trial was chasing the constant object. That's a different pattern of exploration to an infant who's chasing the object that changes. And I should just point out that across each trial is split into two, where the constant and changing images switch sides so that we can disentangle a side preference from a preference for a particular object. So this was a collaboration with Marina Kalashnikova, who's also was trained in Sydney, and Paul Quinn. And so we collected data in two testing sites, in Singapore in my lab, and then in Spain in Marina's lab. We had 30 monolingual infants, 23 bilingual infants who were 5 to 6 months of age, and then 23 monolingual infants and 21 bilingual infants. And you can see from this slide that they were heterogeneous in the language experience. So I'll just say that we did not find an effect of lab or testing site. We also did not find an effect of age, but we did find an effect of language experience. So on this chart, on the x-axis is the blocks, so the trials going from 1 to 10 were binned into individual blocks. And then on the y-axis is the preference for the novel stimulus. And what we see if we look at the blue lines first is exactly what Franz found, which is the infants begin with a null preference. And then as they see trials over and over again, they begin to look at the novel object. bilingual infants do something different. So they begin with a preference for that changing object, and that preference remains or persists over the testing session. So we collected from the infant's parents how much time they spend listening to a second language to map that onto their looking preferences. And we found across samples and across ages a negative relationship between their exposure to a first language and their novelty preference. So in other words, infants that had more second language exposure had a more significant novelty preference. So this correlation remains significant, even if we only looked at the bilingually exposed infants. So just to summarize so far, what we find from these studies is that very basic measures of visual attention that really underlie a lot of what we do experimentally to look at infant psychological processes vary based on whether infants are bilingually exposed or monolingually exposed. And this has consequences for one of the earliest slides I presented, showing that in studies that don't have to do with language development, people often don't report language experience. But even for a study on object perception or false belief that uses a looking time paradigm, language experience may actually modulate the way in which infants attend to and engage with visual stimuli. But the consequence that I wanted to focus on is not the experimental significance, but really the significance for understanding bilingualism and pathways to learning. So these studies suggest that bilingual infants may navigate and explore their visual environment in fundamentally different ways to monolingual infants. And these differences may set in several months before infants begin to show us conversationally that they're bilingual. So these are really mere exposure effects. In particular, they may distribute attention more broadly and scan a wider range of targets. And these data have, both these kinds of patterns have also been demonstrated by other groups. So in particular, Dean D'Souza and Marina Kalashnikova and other labs with other bilingual populations. So I want to move on to looking at whether bilingualism influences attentional flexibility and openness in more specialized domains. So looking particularly at linguistic information and then at social category information. So with linguistic development, I'll focus on a fundamental transition in early language development, which is perceptual narrowing. So I'm sure many of you know that infants go through a process of perceptual narrowing where they begin with very broad-based sensitivities to language changes or sound shifts. And then as they grow older over the course of their first year, they begin to specialize in sounds of their language. They begin to show more fine-grained sensitivities for sounds that convey meaning in their language. And the cost of this is they begin to show weaker sensitivity to sounds that don't mean anything in their language. So I'll just give an example. If you were to learn English, you would have the sound T, which is the first sound of tap. And that's different from the sound D. If you learn Hindi, for example, you have to learn that the sound T actually has two different instantiations. It has a retroflex instantiation, so ta versus ta, which is dental. And this difference is difficult for listeners to hear if they don't speak Hindi, but it is very relevant to understanding Hindi. So if you would go to an Indian restaurant and you would order a bowl of dal, that's a bowl of lentils, that's different from the sound dal, which is a bunch of twigs. So you have to be really sensitive to this distinction if you're learning Hindi, but you don't have to be very sensitive to it if you're learning English. So infants quite early in their lives go from being sort of universal, broad-based listeners to becoming listeners that have an ear that is then tuned to their own language. Perceptual narrowing is an old theory. It's very well established, and it's been demonstrated across different domains: music perception, speech perception, perception of racial categories. But I'll focus on speech perception for now. So before I go into studies looking at bilingual infants, I want to present the results of a meta-analysis looking at who makes up the evidence basis for empirical studies on perceptual narrowing and how generalizable is this theory for understanding infants around the world. Recent analysis that was a collaboration with Sarah Rajendra and Reiko Mizuka, looking at the language background of participants who have, of all studies, published studies in perceptual narrowing. So we find that this theory is overwhelmingly grounded in studies with monolingual infants, with very little comparisons between monolingual and bilingual infants, and very little just in bilingual infants. Within monolingual infants, we see a very strong focus on languages like English and a relatively marginal focus on languages that are very widely spoken, like Mandarin Chinese, that accounts for only 2% of published studies. Looking at the kinds of sounds that make up the theories, if we look at the proportion of all studies on the y-axis, and then whether the evidence is consistent, partially consistent, or inconsistent with perceptual narrowing, the idea that infants go from being a universal listener to a language-specific listener over the first year of life, we see that the evidence comes predominantly from particular sounds, from consonants, and in particular from the sound that I just produced, which is the Hindi dental retroflex sound, and English sounds like ba and da. Now the question is, are these sounds actually very common around the world's languages? So on the right, you see a pie chart, which is all the sounds that are represented in all published studies that use consonant contrast and perceptual narrowing. And you can see an overwhelming focus on particular kinds of stop consonants. On the left is an estimation of the predominance of sounds, consonant sounds, in languages around the world. And we see that there are many categories of sounds. So the light red columns are very common sounds. There are a lot of categories of sounds or consonant contrasts that are not represented in the perceptual narrowing literature. So this has consequences for understanding the representation and generalizability of theories of perceptual narrowing. So in the first set of studies, I'll talk about effects of bilingualism or associations with bilingualism on the perceptual narrowing. So these were studies collected in Singapore with monolingual English infants and English Mandarin bilingual infants. And we tested infants towards the end of the window of perceptual narrowing, so around 10 to 12 months, when theories of perceptual narrowing would tell us that infants remain sensitive to sounds that are relevant in English, like ba, da, or the language Mandarin, but lose sensitivity to sounds that are not relevant to their languages. We use visual habituation, and we tested all infants on ba versus da, which is phonemic in Mandarin and English, as a native contrast, and as a non-native contrast, we tested infants on the Hindi ta versus ta, which is phonemic in Hindi, but it's not phonemic in English or Mandarin. So I'll just give a demonstration of this paradigm to show you how it works. Okay, so it's subtitled because it can be very difficult to hear this ta distinction if you haven't grown up hearing a language that uses this distinction to communicate meaning. But essentially, the infant is habituated to a sound like ta, and then after a fixed amount of time, the sound changes to ta. And then we look at the difference between looking time to the last ta trial and then the first ta trial. And if infants can tell these sounds apart, then we look for an elevation in looking time, so a dishabituation response when they hear the first ta trial. So what do we see with monolingual infants? When they hear ba versus da, we see that difference. So they distinguish ba versus da. But when we present ta versus ta, they do not detect the difference. So this is what we'd expect from sort of textbook accounts of perceptual narrowing. For bilingual infants, for ba versus da, they distinguish these sounds, as we would expect. But they also distinguish ta versus ta. So they can also tell apart this Hindi contrast. And that was surprising because bilingual infants were learning a language that does not distinguish ta versus ta. So in a follow-up, we looked at whether having a different kind of stimulus made a difference. So we, instead of having this checkerboard pattern that is presumed not to be an object that infants would attach meaning to, what if you change the setup to include an object that infants then map onto meaning? So I'll play a video of this type of paradigm. It's exactly the same except that there's an object, and in that sense is intended to engage word learning mechanisms.
Ta, 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 ta.
So infants are habituated to this object instead of a checkerboard pattern, and it's labeled a ta, and they hear this over and over again, and then they're presented with a change where the same object is now labeled a ta. If infants are sensitive to this distinction in word learning, then they should show an elevation in looking time, so a surprise response to the change trial versus the habituation trial. So in this experiment, we tested monolingual infants and bilingual infants at 3 age groups. The monolingual infants were all English exposed. The bilingual infants were English and Mandarin exposed. And we tested older infants because we wanted to look at infants when they were actually in the emergent stages of word learning. So what we found was that in spite of having undergone perceptual narrowing at an auditory or acoustic level at the end of the first year of life, at 14 months of age, both monolingual and bilingual infants differentiated ta versus ta in a word learning paradigm. At 19 months, monolingual infant sensitivities had narrowed and they no longer distinguished ta versus ta. So they had sort of closed off this Hindi distinction. Bilingual infants who again are learning English and Mandarin that neither language uses this contrast, continue to differentiate the Hindi sound ta and ta. So they showed sort of a later point of narrowing. And at 24 months, bilingual infants looked a lot like monolingual infants. In 19 months, they showed a postponement in perceptual narrowing in using these sounds in a word learning paradigm. So one idea that crossed my mind was that, well, these infants, the bilingual infants and the monolingual infants, are raised in Singapore, where there are Indo-European languages like Tamil that use this distinction, ta versus ta. So what if we take a sound that is very far outside of their experience, so using a click contrast from Bele, which is a language that uses click consonants that these infants could never have heard. So I'll just play the consonants that we use, which actually recorded in Sydney, to give you a sense of what they sound like. Play that one more time. So all parents of infants confirmed that neither monolingual infants nor bilingual infants had ever heard these sounds in Singapore. At the same time, monolingual infants were not sensitive to this click contrast, but bilingual infants were sensitive to this contrast, even though it's obviously very far afield of their perceptual experience. So if we look at early language development, early language knowledge in monolingual and bilingual infants, we see some effects of bilingualism on early speech perception, and these are relatively proximate effects. So we can imagine that reasons why being bilingual, and I'll go into this towards the end of the talk, might make you more open or keep you sort of in a holding pattern in listening to sounds of other languages. But we also see distal effects. So we see that bilingualism can just modulate the way in which infants allocate attention within their visual environment and navigate their visual scene. And in particular, we see an orientation towards novel information. We see reduced constraints and greater perceptual flexibility. And this is not something that's specific to bilingualism. So as I mentioned earlier on, perceptual narrowing has also been evidenced in race perception and musical perception. And in those domains, diversifying experiences, so for example, having a multiracial caregiver or hearing musical sounds of different languages can actually keep infants' perception open and more flexible relative to having a mono-experiential environment. So the last set of studies I'll present before going into theoretical framework is social processes. So whether bilingualism is associated with an increase in social openness towards other people. And in particular, I'm going to present a couple of studies looking at social bias in bilingual versus monolingual infants. So the first set of studies looked at associations between being bilingual and reliance on information about participants' race in social learning and language comprehension. And the question that I was interested in is whether bilingual experience is associated with greater openness to social category information. So I used a paradigm that is a little bit tricky to explain, so I'll present a video, but it really is a paradigm looking at bias towards particular racial groups in infants before you can ask them what their preferences are. So this paradigm was developed by Naichi Xiao, and it capitalizes on infants' tendency to follow the gaze of other people that are doing things with objects. And infants tend to follow the gaze of reliable actors that actually look over at objects that exist versus unreliable actors whether they're the same race or a different race. But if an actor that you're looking at is unreliable, then Xiao showed that infants look over at an unreliable actor if they're the same race, but not if they're a different race. So in other words, at an early age, infants have different sort of criteria for their own race actors versus different race actors. And these were infants tested in China in a monoracial environment. I'll just show you the paradigm to clarify what it really looks like from the infant perspective.
Hi, baby. Look at that.
I am super over with the G, a mass of global energy.
Hi, baby. Look at that. Hi, baby. That's so nice.
There's a tiger in my book. There's a sneaky alligator I can spy on in my book.
Hi, baby. That's so nice.
Come on, wake up your head. Get your head up out of bed.
Okay, so it's a little bit complicated, but what you can see is there are two kinds of actors. There's the same race actor. All of these infants from a Chinese race, and there's a different race actor. So there's a Chinese pair of actors, and there's an Indian pair of actors. And within each racial category, one actor is reliable. So when they look over at a visual display, there's actually something that shows up there. It's reinforced. Another actor is unreliable. So when they look over at this object, the object actually appears on the other side. So trial after trial, the question is whether infants learn that an actor is reliable versus unreliable. And in the final test trial, they actually follow this actor's gaze if they're reliable versus if they're unreliable. But more importantly, do they do this depending on the race of the actor? So what Xiao showed was that when the unreliable actor is the same race, then infants continue to follow the actor's gaze. When the unreliable actor is a different race, they then sort of, in his construct, they lose trust in that actor. So we looked to see whether this depended on language experience. So we tested English monolingual infants who were Chinese race, Mandarin English bilingual infants who were Chinese race, and they were matched on maternal education. They were also matched on the amount of other race contact, and neither group had significant contact with other races or with Indian race adults or children. So what we found with monolingual infants, they looked a lot like Xiao's study. So when actors were reliable, infants followed their gaze, whether they were the same race or a different race. When actors were unreliable, or in our case, 50% reliable, they continued to follow the actor's gaze if the actor was the same race as them, but they lost trust or stopped following the actor's gaze when the actor was a different race from them. So they showed race-dependent selective trust. Bilingual infants showed a different pattern of results. So in other words, they showed a race-independent or race-neutral pattern of gaze following. They followed reliable actors, whether they were the same race or a different race, and they stopped following unreliable actors, whether they were the same race or a different race. So I'll quickly go through a second study that looked at something similar, but in terms of language comprehension. So this study was based on a study by Weatherhead and White, showing that infants interpret language or pronunciation based on what they perceive about the person speaking. So in this case, we had a same race adult just saying, do you see the sock? And a different race adult saying, do you see the sock? But we had correct pronunciation trials where the adult said, do you see the sock? And then mispronunciation trials where the adult said, do you see the sack? We tested monolingual children in Singapore and bilingual children. They were 2 years of age, they're beginning to understand words, and they were matched again on other race contact and on cross-dialectical exposure. They had correct pronunciation trials where they hear, do you see the sock produced by the same race or other race actor, or do you see the bok or the sack produced by the same race actor versus another race actor? And we wanted to see whether infants showed naming effects, or whether they looked preferentially over at the sock, depending on whether it was correctly pronounced or mispronounced in relation to the race of the person that was speaking. So the person was on screen while they were in this experiment. This is a hypothetical data where if infants recognize the word, then we expect them before the object is labeled relative to after the object is labeled to show an elevation in looking time when they hear that label correctly produced, but not when they hear the label misproduced or mispronounced. So what we see on the y-axis is a naming effect, and if that is significantly different from 0, then infants preferentially fixated the object. On the x-axis is the different conditions. So if we go through the monolingual infants, what we see with the correct pronunciation is that both monolingual and bilingual infants, if the word was produced by someone of the same race, preferentially fixated the object. So that's what we would expect. If the object was mispronounced by someone of the same race, then both monolingual and bilingual infants did not look at the object. And that's what we'd expect from recent prior studies. But what we would not expect is that when the speaker was a different race and they produced the words correctly, bilingual infants recognized the words. When they produced the words correctly, monolingual infants did not show evidence of recognizing the words. And when the words were mispronounced, neither monolingual or bilingual infants recognized the words. So the condition that is odd or unexpected was the other race correct pronunciation condition, where only bilingual infants appeared to recognize the word when it was produced by a speaker of a different race. So putting this all together, and I'll briefly go through a sort of unifying theoretical framework, we can see that bilingual experience influences a range of developmental processes, from visual attention to language discrimination to attention to social categories. And what are the commonalities here? So in all of these areas, bilingualism was associated with greater openness and flexibility towards novel information. And this formed the basis of a theoretical paper that I published a couple of years ago, suggesting that bilingualism may reorient infants' perception, learning, early mechanisms towards new information in their environment. So they may attend differently, and that may have downstream consequences for learning and perception. So how can we put this together in sort of the beginnings of a theoretical proposal? So for all learners, variation in the structure of the input reflects variation in the infant's environment. So what is the structure of multilingual input? So in some sense, multilingual input contains reduced predictability. There's greater potential for ambiguity. I don't think that learning accounts that attempt to capture perceptual narrowing really satisfactorily in their current form account for bilingual input. So the idea that there are these sort of neat clusters of information that you then harness, it's a little bit of a different problem for bilingual infants, where these clusters may actually overlap in different ways. When you decide to raise a bilingual infant, you don't decide to keep them up for twice as long or to speak twice as fast. So you count on the fact that they'll get reduced single language input. In that sense, perhaps bilingual infants have to get by on less. So what are the adaptations that may facilitate learning under these conditions? Bilingual infants may engage in broad information sampling, so they may look more broadly around their environment to examine different sources of information, be less tethered to familiarity in their environment, and they may, as a result, be more perceptually flexible. And what is the behavioral expression of this in infants in a laboratory setting? So we may, as a result, see reduced familiarity preferences in bilingual infants, a greater orientation towards novelty, and more flexibility in learning and perception. So more flexibility, more openness in phonetic perception, but also more flexibility in generalizing across speakers based on their sociometric information, in this case, race. And I just wanted to add that there are other labs, so Rachel Barr's lab has shown in multiple studies that bilingual infants also generalize across non-social agents who are performing actions on objects. So I recently submitted, or it's under revision, a theoretical paper to try to present these data in an integrated framework to produce or present a new model or new framework for understanding how bilingualism may shift perception and learning in a way that has downstream consequences for infants' navigation of their environment and also for bilingual proficiency. So I'll just briefly go through this chart, but essentially it starts with the position that bilingualism may reflect, or bilingual environments may reflect, greater environmental complexity. And this may lead to a broad attentional focus that has consequences for learning different kinds of information across different domains. It may also lead to more perceptual openness, so the idea that bilingual infants remain in this sort of holding pattern for longer before converging on underlying structure. And because bilingual infants may have to get by on less, they may become very efficient in processing information because they receive reduced single language input. So to what extent are these results specific to bilingualism, or are these general results of environmental complexity? I think remains a very important empirical question. What are the common underlying mechanisms? So the other groups that have shown these set of results, Dean D'Souza and Rachel Barr and myself, have begun a collaboration to look at whether we find continuity across our different tasks, across our different labs in these areas. So what is the empirical evidence for covariation of behavior across tasks? How specific are these effects? How do different forms of diversity intersect to influence early attention and learning? And what are the downstream consequences? So does it matter for later learning if you approach your environment in different ways on account of bilingual experience? So I'll just end by coming back to the theme of the conference, which is that in many ways, increasing participant diversity diversity of researchers, populations, can strengthen our understanding of human behavior. I think a diverse science is a stronger science. But we're challenged by the fact that relationships between behavior and background are often non-obvious, and they may be difficult to anticipate, but they may also be deterministic. So I'll give another example of a recent study that I conducted on just infant discrimination of Ba versus Da, where we found that infants' Ba-Da discrimination was really dependent on the family's socioeconomic status. So this is something that you would not necessarily predict. We often take discrimination of sounds like Ba and Da to be universal, but they may actually not be universal. And theories that do not integrate underrepresented samples often omit very widely represented populations. And bilingualism is a classic example of this, where most of the world is raised with more than one native language, and understanding how these learners approach the various challenges of learning is really important for having a more generalizable, robust science of learning. So in terms of future directions for our field, I think the greater diversification of learners, locations, and languages can really help us to converge on theories that we have, extant theories, and to look at really important issues of stability of effects, generalizability and replicability of the effects that we have started to integrate into our narrative of learning and development. I think it's very important for us to report and integrate demographic variables, and it can be very difficult to identify variables that are relevant. So how do we know that bilingualism may be relevant to a study on object perception? I just wanted to briefly mention Many Baby Study, which is the large-scale consortium of infant researchers, has presented a framework for identifying demographic variables with the hopes of providing researchers with a tool to integrate demographic information in studies on infant studies. Also critical to our science is replication across tasks, samples, and processes to converge on consistency across these different variables. And having a scale of inference from our studies that is really proportionate to who we've sampled. So if we've sampled a very limited group of infants or a very limited group of adults, ring fencing our conclusions around sample size and sample composition. So I'll stop here, and I just wanted to end by acknowledging all of the participants and their families that took part in these studies, my research assistants that helped to run these studies, and collaborators, and also funding from the Ministry of Education in Singapore and from the National University of Singapore. Thank you.